Before the museums, before the marble statues, before the textbooks, there was Africa, bright, bold, black, the mother of all civilization. But when Europe came knocking, brush in hand, something darker than paint began to spread. You ever notice how every ancient face in the museum looks like it spent too much time in the Alps? Let's get real. They didn't discover history. They redesigned it. See, when Europe crawled out of the Dark Ages, they found themselves surrounded by ruins and relics that didn't look like them. Sculptures with wide noses, paintings with brown skin, frescoes where angels, kings, and queens carried melanin like crowns. So what do you do when you inherit a world built by black hands, but you want to claim the credit? Simple. You repaint the evidence. And that's exactly what they did. When the Renaissance rolled around, that so-called rebirth of art and learning, Europe wasn't creating new truth. They were rewriting the old one. Artists like Michelangelo, Leonardo da Vinci, Raphael, all praised as masters, were given quiet, powerful assignments. Clean up the past, not with history books, but with brushes, chisels, and paint. Their job? To make the divine European. Ever notice how Jesus suddenly became pale, with light brown hair and blue eyes, even though he came from a region where the sun burns darker skin? Or how the pharaohs of Egypt, once carved with African features, started to look more like Roman emperors? That's not coincidence. That's campaign. Because to conquer the world, you don't just need armies, you need imagery. The church knew this. Monarchs knew this. Every painting of a white saint, every fresco of a pale Ethiopian, every marble statue with the nose chipped off, it all served one quiet, sinister mission: erase the black origin of human greatness and replace it with a European ideal. That's why they chipped noses off statues. That's why they restored paintings and bleached skin tones in oil. That's why the same museums that guard stolen African relics will tell you, with a straight face, that Cleopatra looked like an Italian actress. But here's the real kicker. This wasn't just vanity. It was psychological warfare. When you repaint a people's image, you repaint their power. You rewrite their role in the world. You tell generations of children, black and white alike, that greatness was never brown. That genius, holiness, and beauty were born in Europe, not Africa. You create a new reality, where everything noble is pale, and everything dark is primitive. And it worked, because centuries later, that brushstroke campaign still lives on every screen, every classroom, every stained glass window. Even the way we imagine ancient wisdom, scrolls, scholars, philosophers, has been Euro-styled. We picture Socrates, not Imhotep. We see Aristotle, not the African mathematicians who taught him geometry in Egypt. Ask yourself, how did the same continent that taught the world art, medicine, and architecture suddenly become the one civilized by Europe? That's the lie we inherited. The lie painted over our truth. And they didn't just repaint Africa. They repainted humanity itself. Every angel, every saint, every prophet, from the Bible to the Sistine Chapel, was bleached into submission. When the power of God looks like you start believing you are God. When it doesn't, you start believing you're less than human. But what's wild, even back then, some artists knew what they were doing. In secret corners of Europe, in monasteries, old churches, and forgotten galleries, you can still find traces of the original colors, darker skin tones under layers of newer paint, African halos behind the plaster, black Madonnas worshipped quietly in Catholic corners where nobody dared repaint them. Those images survived because some people refused to destroy the truth completely. The Black Madonna, one of the oldest depictions of the Virgin Mary, still stands across France, Spain, and Poland. And every historian worth their salt knows those statues weren't blackened by candle smoke. They were carved that way from the beginning. So when we talk about how Europe repainted Africa white, we're not just talking about art. We're talking about identity theft on a civilizational scale. the greatest PR campaign in history, and the media of the time, the painters, sculptors, priests, and kings, were all in on it, because whoever controls the image controls the mind. That's the formula they built the modern world on. Paint a man as a savage, and no one will question why he's enslaved. Paint God in your own image, and you can justify anything: colonization, conversion, genocide, all in the name of civilization. They used art as a weapon, not decoration. Every brushstroke was a message. Every marble statue was propaganda. Every missing nose, a silenced voice. But here's the truth that still scares the system: paint can't kill bloodline, erasure can't delete DNA, and no amount of restoration can hide the sun that raised Egypt, Nubia, Axum, or Mali. So the next time you walk through a museum and see a pale statue of an Egyptian, remember this: that's not history, that's editing. That's the visual version of a lie, carved, painted, and polished until it became believable. And once you realize that, you gotta ask yourself one thing: if they could repaint Africa white, what else did they erase? Let's pull back the curtain. Because behind every masterpiece that made Europe look divine, there was money, a lot of it. And that money came from one place: the church. The Catholic Church wasn't just a religious institution, it was the most powerful corporation on earth. Land, armies, gold, they owned it all. And they understood something about human psychology long before psychology had a name. If you control what people see, you control what they believe. So while priests were preaching salvation on Sunday, bishops were commissioning artists on Monday, not to capture truth, but to craft illusion. Think about it. The Renaissance didn't come from nowhere. The artists didn't wake up one morning with paintbrushes and genius. They were sponsored. Michelangelo, funded by the Vatican; Leonardo da Vinci, backed by elite Italian families, tied to the church; Raphael, paid to decorate papal apartments. These weren't independent artists painting their visions. They were employees on divine payroll, and their mission was clear: create a new visual order. The church wanted an image of God, angels, prophets, and saints that looked like them. Because the truth that the earliest Christians were African and Middle Eastern, that the Holy Family sought refuge in Egypt, didn't fit the narrative they were selling. Europe needed a religion that placed them at the center of the universe. So they didn't just repaint the walls of churches, they repainted the mind of a continent. Under the patronage system, painters and sculptors became ideological soldiers. When Michelangelo painted the Last Judgment in the Sistine Chapel, he didn't just immortalize faith, he Europeanized it. White skin glowing like marble, blonde angels, a pale Christ with a chiseled physique more Roman than Hebrew. Every inch of that ceiling said one thing: divinity belongs to Europe. And when you walked into a cathedral, overwhelmed by that art, what choice did your mind have but to believe it? That's how propaganda works: quiet, beautiful, inescapable. But this wasn't only about aesthetics, it was economics. See, colonialism wasn't born on the battlefield, it was baptized in the basilica. The church knew that to justify the Christianization of Africa and the Americas, it needed a visual doctrine, images that said, "We are the chosen ones." If Europeans looked like God, then everyone else automatically looked like they needed saving. That's the psychological foundation of white supremacy, painted right on the ceiling of the holiest place on earth. Meanwhile, African and Moorish art, the kind that once influenced the very architecture of Europe, was being suppressed or rebranded. The Moorish mosaics in Spain, filled with intricate geometry and African craftsmanship, erased under layers of Catholic iconography. The Ethiopian crosses that predated European Christianity by centuries, ignored, labeled, exotic. And the irony: many of these European masters learned from African traditions. The techniques of fresco, perspective, gold leaf, and proportion came from the Mediterranean trade routes, places once ruled by Africans. The Renaissance wasn't born in Florence, it was imported from Timbuktu, Cairo, and Cordoba, cities where knowledge was older than Rome. But power has a way of rewriting its origin story. The church took African knowledge, mixed it with European ambition, and then wrapped it in pale skin. That's how you manufacture a divine monopoly. Even the angels got repainted. Early Byzantine art, North African manuscripts, and Ethiopian icons show celestial beings with brown or black skin. But by the 1500s, those same figures turned snow white, winged, blue-eyed, feathered propaganda. The deeper you dig, the clearer it becomes. The Renaissance wasn't just a rebirth of art, it was a burial of black divinity, because when they whitewashed the saints, they also whitewashed the story. Think about St. Augustine, one of the most important theologians in Christian history, born in North Africa, dark-skinned, yet by the time Europe finished remembering him, he was portrayed as a pale monk with Roman features. The same happened to Moses, Mary, Joseph, all of them rebranded under a European brush. And if you're thinking, maybe they didn't know what the people looked like, think again. The church had access to the oldest manuscripts, relics, and scrolls, far older than what we see today. They knew exactly where these people came from. They knew the geography, the language, the lineage. But truth wasn't profitable, power was. So, they gave the world a divine mirror, one that only reflected Europe. This strategy became the blueprint for every empire that followed. Colonizers didn't just bring guns and ships. They brought paintings, icons, and crosses. They used those images to baptize domination. They'd point to a pale Christ and say, "We bring you civilization." They'd show a dark-skinned people and say, "We bring you salvation." And yet, the same church that painted heaven white was built on African bones. St. Peter's Basilica, the crown jewel of Christianity, was funded partly by gold looted from Africa. Its architecture, inspired by African domes, its foundations, laid by masons trained in Moorish geometry. They covered the truth in plaster, but the blueprint never disappeared. You can still see it in the columns, in the arches, in the mathematical ratios that scream North African design. The fingerprints of the very people they tried to erase are still there, carved into the stone of their holy empire. But the real tragedy, generations grew up believing that holiness had a color, and it wasn't theirs. And once you believe that, everything else falls in line. Inferiority becomes natural, obedience becomes sacred, colonization becomes destiny. So the next time you see those paintings in a church, ask yourself, was that art, or was that advertising? Because if God could be rebranded, what else could be? When Europe finished repainting God, it turned to repainting history, and this time, the brush wasn't in the hands of artists. It was in the hands of scholars. See, when you control art, you shape faith, but when you control history, you shape identity. That's why the same century that gave us white angels also gave us white scientists. Claiming Africa had no civilization before Europe arrived. The timing wasn't an accident. It was a campaign. After the Renaissance, Europe entered the so-called Age of Discovery. But what they really discovered was the power of narrative. They realized they could conquer not only land, but also memory. If they could rewrite Africa's past, they could justify owning its future. So, they sent explorers with two missions: find gold and find proof that Africa was inferior. And when they didn't find that proof, they made it up. Museums became their temples. Walk into the British Museum, the Louvre, the Vatican archives. You'll find Africa everywhere. Statues, gold, manuscripts, masks, even mummies. But every piece is stripped of its story. No mention of kingdoms, trade routes, or scientific advancements. Just primitive artifacts, just trophies of a continent, presented as wild and wordless. They called it preservation, but what they were preserving wasn't history, it was dominance. Because when you steal someone's culture and display it in your house, you're not honoring them, you're declaring ownership. Let's call it what it was: cultural colonization. While Europe was looting Africa's temples, tombs, and libraries, it was also building institutions to legitimize that theft. That's where anthropology, archaeology, and race science came in. Entire fields created to put academic weight behind white supremacy. You ever wonder why old textbooks say Africa had no written language? Because European scholars refused to recognize African scripts, the Nisibiti writing of Nigeria, the Jez language of Ethiopia, the Medu Neter of Kemet, all dismissed as symbols or primitive marks, but the same scribbles on cave walls in Europe, early writing systems, double standard, polished in Latin, and then came the museums. They started curating Africa the same way the church curated heaven, whitening, renaming, reframing. Benin's royal bronzes, masterpieces of metallurgy that Europeans couldn't even replicate at the time, were labeled tribal art. The Nok terracotta sculptures, centuries older than Greek art, were said to be mysterious rather than advanced. Egyptian statues with full lips and wide noses, catalogued as Nubian influence, never African origin. See how they play the game? They separate Africa from Africa, Egypt from the continent, blackness from brilliance, so that when you think of civilization, you picture marble, not melanin. Meanwhile, the universities joined in. Oxford, Cambridge, the Sorbonne, all built their reputations on African relics. They studied, dissected, and classified the remains of our ancestors while teaching generations of students that Africa contributed nothing to the modern world. And when African scholars tried to correct the record, silenced, discredited, mocked, because the story was too profitable to change. European power depended on two lies: that Africa was primitive and that Europe was savior. Without those lies, colonialism collapses. Without those lies, slavery becomes unforgivable, not divine destiny. That's why museums still refuse to return stolen artifacts, not because of logistics, but because of optics. Returning those items means admitting the foundation of European history was built on theft. But here's the real kicker: many of those same artifacts prove Africa's genius beyond question. The Dogon people of Mali had knowledge of the Sirius star system before telescopes existed. The maps of Mansa Musa's Mali Empire showed global trade networks centuries before Columbus. The Great Zimbabwe ruins were so advanced that Europeans insisted Arabs must have built it, because their worldview couldn't process African excellence, so they buried it under glass and plaques. They called it Exhibit A instead of evidence of empire. It's psychological warfare, a slow erasure dressed as scholarship. Museums became the new cathedrals: white walls, soft lighting, silent reverence, where Europe worshipped itself. The difference? This time, the icons weren't saints. They were stolen African gods, and the professors were their new priests. They wrote textbooks declaring Negroid skulls less intelligent. They drew racial charts ranking humanity by skin tone. They called it science. They gave it Latin names. But underneath it all was the same paintbrush, the one that turned black angels white. Europe's greatest masterpiece wasn't a painting. It was a story, one that replaced Africa's truth with its own reflection. And here's the cruel genius of it: after centuries of repetition, even Africans began to believe it. Colonized minds raised on colonized art. Children taught that their ancestors were slaves, not scholars, that their skin was a mark of shame, not royalty. That's how deep the campaign went. You see, whitewashing isn't just about color, it's about authorship. Whoever holds the pen defines the past, and whoever defines the past controls the future. So when the British Museum says it's protecting world heritage, what it's really saying is, we still own your narrative. And that's why this matters, because if we don't reclaim our past, someone else will keep selling it to us, ticket by ticket, exhibit by exhibit. They turned Africa's libraries into display cases. They turned ancestors into specimens. They turned genius into folklore. But you can't kill truth. You can hide it, rename it, lock it behind glass, but it waits. And right now, truth is knocking, because digital archives are opening. African historians are cross-referencing old maps and trade logs. DNA studies are exposing lineages that link Europe's royal houses back to Africa. Even the Vatican's own paintings, stripped under ultraviolet scans, reveal brown-skinned saints beneath layers of white pigment. The receipts are leaking. So ask yourself, if the truth was harmless, why did they spend 500 years covering it? Before the paintbrush, before the propaganda, before the lies in marble, Europe wore Africa's blood like a crown. That's not metaphor, that's genealogy. See, when they repainted Africa white, they weren't just bleaching images, they were hiding bloodlines, because Europe's royal houses weren't as pure as their portraits suggested. They were built on the same African dynasties they later tried to erase. Let's start where the records still whisper the truth. The Moors, from the 8th to the 15th century, African rulers, dark-skinned, North and West African Moors, controlled vast parts of Spain, Portugal, and southern France. They brought with them mathematics, architecture, irrigation, astronomy, medicine, the entire blueprint of civilization Europe claims as its own. These weren't invaders, they were educators. Before the Moors, Europe's castles were made of wood and mud. After the Moors, marble palaces, aqueducts, observatories, libraries. The Spanish word Ojalá, meaning God willing, comes from the Arabic Inshallah. The cities of Seville, Granada, and Cordoba still carry the fingerprints of African brilliance. Now here's where it gets wild. Those same African bloodlines intermarried into European nobility. The House of Habsburg, the Portuguese royal line, even early British monarchs, all have traces of African ancestry. One of the clearest examples, Queen Charlotte of Mecklenburg-Strelitz, wife of King George III of England. The same King George America rebelled against. Portraits of Charlotte, before retouching, show a woman with unmistakably African features. Full lips, broad nose, dark curls. Her lineage traces back to a 13th century African branch of the Portuguese royal family, descended from Alfonso III and his Moorish mistress, Madragana. You ever wonder why so many of her portraits were updated later? Because a black queen didn't fit the empire's fantasy of white divine right. So they lightened her skin, slimmed her features, and rewrote her story. Sound familiar? It's the same playbook they used on Egypt, on saints, on Jesus himself. Now let's step back even further. Before the Moors, Africa had already birthed the dynasties that would inspire Europe's obsession with crowns. Egypt's pharaohs weren't just kings, they were god kings. Their regalia, their throne structures, their rituals, all copied later by Europe's monarchies. The very idea of the divine right of kings, that rulers were chosen by God, came straight out of Kemet. Pharaohs called it Ma'at, divine order. Europe just translated it and changed the face. Even the word regal comes from rex, Latin for king, but the earliest word for kingly authority, nogolo, nogos, negus, all come from African tongues. Ethiopia's kings were called negus, centuries before Europe even had organized crowns. And here's where it hits deep. Ethiopia, one of the only nations never colonized, had direct connections to the line of Solomon, through the Queen of Sheba and her son, Menelik V. That's royal blood that predates every European monarchy. Yet Europe still teaches Africa as the student, not the source. Ask yourself, why would Europe claim divine rule, but hide the African origins of its symbolism? Because white supremacy needed a spotless face, literally. Once the African features of royal Europe became inconvenient, artists got to work. Oil paint became propaganda. Royal painters, like Sir Thomas Lawrence and Hans Holbein, learned to correct portraits, lighten skin, narrow noses, soften curls. The new royal look wasn't just aesthetic, it was political. It created an image of white perfection to justify colonial domination. That's why, even today, we associate royalty with pale skin and golden hair, not because it's historically true, but because it was painted to be. And yet, despite centuries of bleaching, the receipts never fully disappeared. Historians found records, describing early Portuguese and Spanish nobles as swarthy, brown, dark. The word Moor itself, from the Latin morus, simply meant black. The 16th century English playwrights, like Shakespeare, used Moor and African interchangeably. Othello wasn't a metaphor, he was a reminder. So why erase that? Because it shattered Europe's illusion of purity. It revealed that the same people they enslaved were once the blood of their kings. That's the kind of truth that keeps empires up at night. But there's more. The Renaissance, the so-called rebirth of European culture, didn't appear out of thin air. It began in Italy, right after the fall of Moorish Spain. Thousands of African scholars, translators, architects, and scientists fled north, bringing centuries of knowledge. Florence, Venice, and Rome absorbed it, then claimed it as their own. That's how Europe rediscovered math, medicine, philosophy, the same subjects the Moors had been teaching for centuries. They erased the teachers and took credit for the classroom. Then, once they had rewritten the syllabus, they repainted the portraits. Art became the final weapon. Every fresco, every sculpture, every icon subtly reshaped what power looked like. Whiteness became holy. Darkness became primitive. It was psychological colonization, disguised as beauty, and it worked. Generations grew up believing light skin was divine, royal, intelligent, while dark skin was cursed, dirty, or sinful. The same brushstrokes that glorified white monarchs dehumanized their African ancestors. But even now, those cracks in the story are showing. Old paintings, scanned under UV light, reveal brown underlayers. Hidden saints, dark-skinned Madonna figures, and untouched frescoes in forgotten chapels still show the truth. Everywhere you look, Africa's image bleeds through the paint, and it raises one question that Europe still can't answer. If royalty, faith, and civilization were all once painted in black, what else have they bleached out of history? When you control the story, you control the soul. And Europe learned that faster than anyone. By the time the Renaissance crowned itself as the rebirth of knowledge, the architects of history had already chosen which truths would live and which would be buried. The brush became the sword, the Bible became the contract, and whiteness became the mask that power wore. The bleaching of Africa's image wasn't random, it was deliberate, coordinated, and profitable. It turned history into propaganda. Propaganda that justified slavery, colonialism, and every theft that followed. The first erasure didn't start in a classroom or a church. It started in an artist's studio. Painters under royal commission were told, make them look noble, make them look divine. And divine in the new Europe meant pale. The darker shades of truth were scraped away with every layer of paint. Look at early medieval icons, Jesus, Mary, and the saints, with brown faces, wide noses, textured hair. Then, move forward a few centuries, and you'll see how those same faces slowly lighten until they become porcelain. That's not evolution, that's propaganda. And the agenda behind it was clear. Whiteness equals purity, authority, legitimacy. Darkness equals sin, savagery, subhuman. By the 15th century, this visual lie was the cornerstone of European expansion. If white was divine, then to conquer darker lands was not theft, it was salvation. They didn't just rewrite history, they rewrote morality. Churches became museums of manipulation. Bibles were reprinted with European faces. Cathedrals painted with alabaster angels. Every image screamed one message: God looks like us. This message wasn't just spiritual, it was geopolitical. It prepared minds for empire. When Spain and Portugal launched their voyages of discovery, they did it with crosses in hand and whitened saints in their sails. The doctrine of discovery, signed by the Pope himself, declared any non-Christian, non-white land empty and ripe for claiming. Africa, the mother of civilization, was declared a blank map. That's what happens when you erase people from their own story. They become ghosts in someone else's book. But the deception didn't stop at the church door. It moved into science. In the 18th and 19th centuries, Europe's obsession with proving its superiority created race science. Men like Carl Linnaeus and Johann Blumenbach began categorizing humanity, not to understand it, but to justify hierarchy. They ranked Africans at the bottom, Europeans at the top, and wrapped it all in the language of biology. They measured skulls, noses, skin tones, anything that could serve the lie. And yet, the same empires claiming African inferiority were built on African gold, African labor, African innovation. The contradiction was staggering, but the propaganda machine was louder. Because here's the truth: white supremacy was never about fact. It was about fear. The fear that if Africa's light was acknowledged, Europe's illusion of greatness would crumble. So they buried it under paint, under scripture, under science. You can see the cover-up in museums even today. Statues with broken noses, mislabeled artifacts, and African deities renamed as Mediterranean. Thousands of relics from Nubia, Mali, Benin, Kemet, all sitting behind glass in London, Paris, and Berlin. They call it preservation, but what it really is possession, and possession, to an empire, is power. But every empire that builds itself on stolen stories eventually cracks, because the truth always finds a way to breathe. Now, as the world reconnects through digital archives and decolonized education, those hidden records are being re-examined. Satellite imagery reveals ancient African cities with mathematical precision centuries before Europe's industrial age. Genetic studies confirm the African influence in southern Europe's bloodlines. Even the Vatican holds archives that show black saints and popes erased from official memory. You see, the system wasn't just whitewashing history, it was whitewashing identity. For centuries, black children were told their past began with slavery, but no one told them that the first universities in the world, Timbuktu, Al-Qarawiyyin, were African. That Greek philosophy, celebrated as the foundation of Western thought, was built on Egyptian teachings from the Library of Alexandria. Europe didn't invent civilization, it inherited it, then hid the receipts. So who changed the story? It wasn't just kings and colonizers, it was the alliance between church, crown, and canvas. The church gave divine justification, the crown gave political power, the canvas gave the illusion. Together they created an empire, not just over land, but over memory. And that empire still rules minds today. When a child sees an image of Jesus, with blonde hair and blue eyes, or when textbooks skip from Greece to Rome, without a word about Nubia or Kush, the spell continues. But cracks are forming. The age of blind belief is ending. Because the truth doesn't need to shout, it just needs to survive long enough to be rediscovered. Every rediscovered text, every unearthed fresco, every DNA report is a form of resistance. They whisper what the empires feared most, that Africa was not the shadow of civilization, it was the light before the dawn, and the greatest rebellion now is remembering, to unlearn what was painted for us, to reclaim what was stolen, to reintroduce the world to its mother, Africa. Because the biggest lie ever told wasn't that Africa was dark, it was that light was ever European. Every empire knows you don't need chains if you can paint the cage pretty enough. Europe didn't just steal Africa's gold, it stole the image of God, the blueprint of humanity, and repackaged both to serve the throne. Once the art was changed, the psychology followed. Control the image, control the mind. That's how they did it. Take the Renaissance, often praised as Europe's rebirth, but what they don't say is what had to die for it to be born. Black saints, brown Madonnas, Nubian prophets vanished from walls and manuscripts. Artists like Michelangelo and Leonardo da Vinci didn't just create beauty, they created whiteness as divinity. The creation of Adam didn't just touch fingers, it rewired perception. God became pale. Humanity followed. Every painting, every sculpture, every fresco was psychological warfare. If heaven looked white, then hell started to look like Africa. By the 1600s, art was the propaganda arm of empire. Painters, priests, and patrons all worked together to build a visual hierarchy. Pale equals holy, dark equals heathen. It wasn't art, it was armor. Because once the world believed that whiteness was purity, Europe could invade in the name of civilizing the world, and it worked. The brush became more powerful than the sword. You didn't have to conquer a people physically if you could convince them they were already beneath you. That's the brilliance of the whitewashing campaign. It didn't just rewrite history, it reshaped psychology. By the time the first ships reached West Africa, Europe had already painted the story of who was master and who was subject. The image came before the invasion. Even after colonization, the same tactics continued. Museums, schoolbooks, and media became modern temples of the lie. Scientific racism turned pigment into a prison. Pseudo-scholars used skulls, nose shapes, and skin tones to rank humanity, and art reinforced it with halos over pale heads and devils drawn in brown. That's how deep the spell ran. But here's the part they don't want you to realize. The entire European identity depended on that illusion. If they admitted that black civilizations had mapped the stars, built pyramids aligned to celestial grids, and produced philosophers before Greece existed, Europe's birthright to rule would collapse overnight. So they doubled down. They didn't just erase, they inverted. They took the faces of African pharaohs, saints, and scholars, and bleached them. The Moors who taught Europe science became Arabs. The Egyptians who charted medicine became Mediterranean, and the prophets of the Bible, men born in Africa, became Europeans overnight. Every brushstroke was an act of empire. Every whitewashed fresco was a flag, and once the image was burned into people's minds, the chains became invisible. That's the genius of psychological colonization. The body can be freed, but the mind stays captured. Fast forward to the modern era. The propaganda didn't end, it evolved. Cinema, textbooks, and advertising replaced the cathedral walls. White Jesus turned into Hollywood Jesus. Tarzan made Africa a jungle playground for European fantasy. Black genius got framed as primitive art, while European copies of it hung in the Louvre for millions. They didn't just colonize the land, they colonized imagination. And when you control imagination, you control destiny. Think about it. If your heroes, your gods, your geniuses all look like someone else, what happens to your sense of self? That's not just erasure, that's conditioning. The real war was never on Africa's soil, it was in her image. And that's why this story still matters. Because even today, every discovery that proves ancient Africa's brilliance gets met with resistance. Every time scholars reveal that Greek philosophy borrowed from Kemet, or that black saints filled medieval Europe, the same gatekeepers say, well, we can't be sure. But they were sure enough to publish the lies. They want doubt where there used to be memory, confusion where there used to be confidence. But here's the reversal. The truth is resurfacing. High-resolution imaging has exposed original pigments on ancient statues, revealing dark skin tones that were hidden under centuries of white paint. DNA tests from mummies confirm African ancestry. Early church manuscripts show brown-skinned apostles before the edits. The receipts are everywhere now. The lie was global, but so is the awakening. And once a people see their true reflection, the control breaks. That's what Europe always feared, not rebellion, but recognition. Because recognition restores power. See, when you know your ancestors built the first observatories, mapped the cosmos, and taught writing before Rome had a road, you stop begging for validation. That's why they fought so hard to control the image. Because the moment you see yourself as the origin, their illusion collapses. The most dangerous weapon isn't a sword or a gun, it's a painting. Because a painting outlives the painter, and when that painting defines what beauty, divinity, and civilization look like, it defines who the world believes they belong to. But now we're repainting the truth, one revelation at a time. The question is, When the world finally sees the original face of civilization, what happens to the ones who sold the fake? You want to know what really kept European rulers up at night? It wasn't African warriors or revolts. It was African knowledge. See, guns can conquer bodies, but knowledge conquers time. And Africa had thousands of years' worth. Mathematics, astronomy, architecture, medicine, the entire foundation of Western civilization was written in black ink long before Europe even learned how to hold a pen. That's not ego, that's archaeology. Let's get straight to it. The libraries of Timbuktu, real-life universities that housed over 700,000 manuscripts, covered everything from advanced geometry to philosophy. Scholars there debated the movement of the planets, while Europe was still calling eclipses witchcraft. And what did the colonizers do when they found those texts? Burned them, sold them, or locked them in vaults. Because truth like that breaks chains faster than fire. Same story in Egypt. When Napoleon invaded in 1798, he didn't just bring soldiers, he brought scientists, artists, and historians. They weren't there to learn, they were there to claim, to scrape Africa's genius, clean, rebrand it, and send it back to Europe with a Latin label. The Rosetta Stone wasn't just an archaeological find, it was a loot box of stolen identity. Europe wasn't scared of African spears, they were scared of African scholars, because the knowledge written in those scripts proved that the first astronomers, physicians, and philosophers were black. The Nile Valley civilizations weren't primitive, they were the motherboards of human progress. But here's the real kicker. They knew. Greek philosophers, like Plato, Pythagoras, and Socrates, all studied in Africa. That's documented. They didn't invent philosophy, they imported it. When they went back to Greece, they turned African spiritual science into Western thought, and Europe built entire school systems on it, pretending the source was their own. That's why the truth terrified them. Because if the world ever realized that the cradle of civilization wasn't Europe, but Africa, everything would flip. Power, religion, economics, even identity. The very idea of whiteness as superior would collapse under its own lie. So what did they do? They rewrote the story. They renamed the scientists, whitewashed the statues, and rebranded stolen discoveries as European breakthroughs. The algebra came from Arabic scholars who learned from African ones. Astronomy, born in Egypt and Nubia, long before Galileo pointed his telescope at the sky. Medicine, the Ebers Papyrus, the oldest known medical text, was written in Africa 1,500 years before Hippocrates. Europe didn't create knowledge, it curated it, selectively. And whenever they couldn't erase the black source, they buried it under mystery. That's why you hear phrases like the lost secrets of Egypt. Lost to who? Not to the descendants of the people who built it. That's what made African knowledge so threatening. It didn't need to bow to Europe's definitions of progress or civilization. It existed before those words even meant anything. When colonizers saw Africans performing surgeries, using algebraic equations in trade, and charting stars with naked eyes, it shattered their worldview. They couldn't fit it into their narrative of savage tribes. So instead of learning, they labeled. Instead of crediting, they conquered. But no amount of labeling could erase the evidence carved into stone. Look at the pyramids, perfectly aligned to Orion's belt, built with precision modern engineers still argue about. Or the great Zimbabwe ruins, massive stone cities, built without mortar, standing for centuries. Europeans tried to claim Arabs must have built them, because admitting black genius didn't fit their script. The fear wasn't that Africa was behind, the fear was that Africa was ahead. So Europe used religion, art, and academia to flip the script, to make the teacher look like the student, the colonizer look like the savior. But cracks in that illusion are everywhere now. Archaeologists are uncovering timelines that don't make sense for the Eurocentric story. Art restorers are finding original pigments, showing brown and golden skin tones under white paint. Geneticists are confirming that ancient populations along the Nile and Mediterranean were African, not Caucasian. Receipts are replacing revisionism, but you can see why that terrifies them again today. Because truth doesn't need permission, it just needs evidence, and the evidence keeps surfacing. What's crazy is, even in Europe's own history, traces of Africa are everywhere. Moorish architecture shaped Spain. African scholars in Andalusia taught math and medicine to Europeans during the so-called Dark Ages. Black saints stood on church walls for centuries before being painted over. The Renaissance wasn't born from isolation, it was a rebirth of African influence, recycled through European lenses. But Europe's fear wasn't just about history, it was about control, because whoever defines the past controls the future. If Africa is remembered as the mother of civilization, then Europe loses its claim as the father. That's why the truth was never just hidden, it was criminalized. From the burning of Timbuktu's manuscripts to the silencing of black scholars in colonial universities, the same fear guided every move. Don't let them remember who they are. But history always leaks through the cracks. Every artifact, every buried manuscript, every DNA test is a ghost whispering, "We were here first." And now those whispers are becoming a roar. So ask yourself, if the truth is finally coming out, what happens to the world built on the lie? Before Europe even knew how to count its own kings, Africa was teaching the world how to count the stars. Let's strip this down to what the receipts say, not the textbooks, not the colonial interpretations, but the facts. Because the deeper you look, the more undeniable it gets. Civilization didn't begin in Europe, it began in Africa, and then Africa exported it. Let's start with Kemet, what they now call Egypt. But don't get it twisted, Egypt wasn't separate from Africa. Egypt was Africa. The temples of Luxor and Karnak weren't random monuments, they were universities, spiritual, scientific, architectural, mathematical, all in one. And these temples were where the world's first foreign exchange students came to learn. Greeks, Romans, Persians, all of them sent their thinkers south to study under black priests, astronomers and philosophers who had already mastered what Europe would later claim as enlightenment. You've heard their names: Pythagoras, Plato, Solon, Herodotus. They didn't invent philosophy, they borrowed it straight from African high science, from schools that predated the Acropolis by millennia. That's not a conspiracy, that's documented history. Herodotus, the so-called father of history, even said it himself. The Egyptians were black-skinned and woolly-haired, but somehow that line got buried in translation, while everything else he wrote got preserved. Funny how that works, huh? See, Africa's education system didn't separate science from spirit. They knew the universe was mathematics, rhythm, vibration, everything in sync. They saw medicine not as cutting and curing, but as balance and harmony. They knew the movement of the stars affected the movement of crops, floods, and life itself. The Nile wasn't just a river, it was a calendar. The Dogon people of Mali, a civilization far from Egypt, mapped the Sirius star system with mathematical precision thousands of years before telescopes existed. They knew Sirius had a twin star, invisible to the naked eye, long before Western astronomers discovered it in 1862. Ask yourself, how? Without satellites, without telescopes, without modern tech. Because they carried knowledge passed down from ancient African scientists who understood cosmic laws that Europe wouldn't even have language for until centuries later. That's not mysticism, that's mastery. And it wasn't isolated. The Moors, those African scholars and builders who ruled Spain for over 700 years, brought the entire intellectual DNA of Africa into Europe. Universities in Cordoba, Toledo, and Granada became the blueprint for the European Renaissance. Algebra, chemistry, navigation, architecture, even the concept of zero, all transferred from Africa through the Moors. Europe's rebirth wasn't born from their genius, it was sparked by African teachers, reminding them how to think again. When Africa taught, the world listened, but when Africa spoke too loudly, the world pretended it couldn't hear. That's why names changed, why statues were chipped, why paintings were repainted. Because if Africa was known as the source, then Europe would have to face a truth that kills its ego. They learned everything from the people they enslaved. Let's get specific. The world's first written language, African, the hieroglyphs of Kemet, and the Meroitic script of Nubia. The first organized calendar, African, based on the star Sirius and the solar cycle. The first advanced surgery, with anesthesia and precision instruments, documented in the Ebers Papyrus, written 1,500 years before Hippocrates. The world's first universities, Sankore, Jingribur, and Sidi Yahya, all in Timbuktu, Mali. Even spiritual systems, monotheism, resurrection, divine judgment, all appear in African theology, long before Judaism, Christianity, or Islam. That's not heresy, that's heritage. But what happens when the teacher becomes the slave, and the student rewrites the book? Europe took African science and turned it into Western discovery. They took African gods and renamed them myths. They took African spirituality and repackaged it as organized religion, cutting out the African roots entirely. The pyramids became mysteries. The Moors became Arabs. The Ethiopian saints became Europeanized. Every name, every face, every idea, rebranded. Even navigation, the thing that made European empires possible, came from Africans. Ancient Egyptians and Nubians built reed boats and sailed across the Mediterranean and the Atlantic long before Columbus was born. Ocean currents, like the Canary Current and the North Equatorial Drift, connect West Africa directly to the Americas. Naturally, Africans knew this. That's why you find African-style stone heads in Mexico and Olmec carvings with distinctly African features. The discovery of the New World wasn't a discovery at all. It was a reunion, and you can trace the fingerprints from Mayan architecture that mirrors Nubian temples to ancient American languages with African root words. The trail of exchange is too deep to deny. When you really think about it, the story isn't that Africa once taught the world. The story is that Africa never stopped. The world just stopped listening. Even today, remnants of African brilliance power the planet in music, language, medicine, and technology. The rhythm in modern beats comes from West African drumming patterns. The architecture of cities like Paris and Washington, D.C. carry blueprints from African builders, and the philosophies of balance, community, and spiritual harmony are being rebranded as New Age when they've been African truths since before time had a name. But here's the painful irony. Africa's children now sit in classrooms that teach them their ancestors were primitive, that they benefited from being colonized, that their genius started only when Europe showed up with a flag. No brother, no sister, the truth is the opposite. When Africa taught the world, there were no chains, there were blueprints, there was light, there was structure, and that's exactly why the system had to be rewritten. Because once the student realized the teacher was black, the illusion of superiority would fall apart. So the real question is, what happens when Africa starts teaching the world again? Let's talk about faces. Real faces. The ones they scraped off stone, bleached on canvas, and replaced in every museum from London to Paris. Because before the chisel, before the repainting, before the lies got printed in textbooks, the rulers of the ancient world looked like you. You ever notice how every documentary about Egypt shows sand-colored statues and pale reconstructions? But when you walk into the Cairo Museum, the truth still peeks through. Burnt skin tones, curly hair carved with precision, full lips, broad noses, African features, not Middle Eastern, not Mediterranean, African. They weren't guessing back then. They were sculpting what they saw. The black pharaohs weren't mythical. They were documented. The 25th dynasty of Egypt, the Kushite dynasty, was an unbroken line of black kings from Nubia, modern-day Sudan. Pharaohs like Piye, Taharka, and Shabaka didn't just rule Egypt. They saved it. They reunited the two lands, restored temples, revived lost traditions, and brought back the high culture that had been fading under foreign influence. Taharqa, especially, was so powerful that even the Bible mentioned him. In 2 Kings 19:9 and Isaiah 37:9, Taharqa, king of Cush, marches against the Assyrians, a black African king written into scripture. The same man who built temples larger than those of his Egyptian predecessors. The same man whose image was carved across Nubia and Thebes, showing him tall, dark, crowned, and divine. So why doesn't anyone show him in Sunday school posters? Why do we see blonde angels, white prophets, and fair-skinned messiahs painted over walls that once told a very different story? Because the art was the battlefield. When Europe invaded Africa, first through the Greeks, then the Romans, then the Crusaders, and finally the colonizers, they didn't just steal gold and land, they stole imagery. Every fresco, every mosaic, every sculpture that showed a black saint or a dark-skinned prophet was gradually altered, restored, or reinterpreted. Restoration became revision. Revision became erasure. Take early Christian art. The oldest icons of Christ, from Egypt, Ethiopia, and even Rome's catacombs, show a man with dark brown skin, woolly hair, and African features. The Black Madonna of Czestochowa in Poland, still venerated, but explained away as being darkened by candle smoke. Nah, that's paint over melanin. The original face was ours. Same thing with the saints. Saint Maurice, an African commander in the Roman army, a man martyred for refusing to kill fellow Christians, was always depicted as a black man across medieval Europe. His image stood in churches from Germany to Switzerland. Then, during the Renaissance, he got lighter, slowly, brushstroke by brushstroke. By the 18th century, Saint Maurice looked like a pale knight. Coincidence? Please. And it wasn't just the saints. Look at the queens. Queen Tiye, mother of Akhenaten and grandmother of King Tut, clearly African. She ruled as co-regent beside her husband, Amenhotep III. The surviving bust of Tiye shows textured hair, deep brown skin, and facial features identical to modern black women from the Nile Valley. But when the replicas were made for European exhibitions, lightened, smoothed, Europeanized, King Tutankhamun, another example. When his tomb was first opened, British papers described his features as Negroid. That word appeared in their own reports. But by the time documentaries were made in the 20th century, suddenly Tut was bronze, olive, Mediterranean. His DNA, however, shows clear Nubian markers, aligning him closer to Central and Northern African populations. Science said one thing, propaganda said another. Guess which version they taught in school? It's the same pattern, over and over. Black kings turned into exotic foreigners. African queens turned into mystery women. African prophets turned into Europeans in robes. And the erasure wasn't random. It was strategic, because if the rulers of Egypt, Cush, Aksum, and Israel were visibly black, then Europe's claim to divine authority, to civilization itself, would collapse. Imagine it, every cathedral in Europe decorated with paintings of black prophets, black angels, black Christs, every noble family tracing their lineage back to African bloodlines, every history book starting not with Greece, but with Nubia. That's not a rewrite, that's the real version they buried. Even Michelangelo got in on it. When he painted the Last Judgment in the Sistine Chapel, he replaced the dark-skinned saints that earlier Italian painters had depicted with pale figures. That wasn't art, that was agenda. A Renaissance propaganda campaign dressed as inspiration, and Europe perfected it. From 1400 to 1900, tens of thousands of restorations were done under the banner of preserving heritage. But what they really preserved was white supremacy through pigment and brush. Because whoever controls the image controls the mind. Once the image of black divinity was replaced with pale perfection, the psychological war began. Black children growing up under colonization saw white angels, white gods, white saviors, and brown devils. brown demons, brown slaves. The palette became propaganda. Art became mind control. But what they didn't count on was the resilience of memory. Because Africa kept the faces alive, in stone, in wood, in story. The Ethiopian Orthodox icons still show dark-skinned saints and prophets. The Nubian temples still carry features untouched by restoration. The Coptic scrolls still describe black holy men and women as divine. And now, in this age of rediscovery, we're seeing those faces again. We're peeling back layers of paint, revealing what they tried to hide. Not just color, but connection. Because every time you see an African child smile at a photo of a pharaoh who looks like them, that's a repair in the timeline. That's a piece of truth restored. Europe may have tried to repaint Africa white, but they couldn't kill the hue of truth. It bleeds through every brushstroke, every relic, every record. So the question is no longer if Africa ruled, it's why did they hide it, and what else did they repaint while they were at it? When the lights of Europe went out, Africa turned them back on. It's one of the biggest hidden stories in world history, how the very people later enslaved and colonized were once the saviors of European civilization. You won't find this in your high school textbooks, but between the 8th and 15th centuries, black and brown scholars, architects, doctors, and philosophers from North and West Africa ruled southern Europe. They were called the Moors, and the truth is simple, there would be no Renaissance without them. After the fall of Rome, Europe was plunged into chaos, famine, disease, ignorance. Libraries were burned, cities collapsed, trade routes vanished. It was the African Islamic empires, especially from regions like Morocco, Mali, and the Maghreb, that preserved the world's scientific and philosophical knowledge. In 711 CE, General Tariq bin Ziyad, a black Berber from North Africa, crossed into Spain with an army of Africans. He named the rock he landed on Jabal Tariq, the mountain of Tariq. Today you know it as Gibraltar. That's right, the literal gateway to Europe carries an African name. Tariq and his army didn't just conquer, they rebuilt. Under the Moors, cities like Cordoba, Granada, and Seville became centers of learning, light, and luxury. Streets were paved, public baths were everywhere, at a time when most of Europe hadn't seen a bathhouse in centuries. Libraries held hundreds of thousands of books, while most European cities couldn't fill a single shelf. Cordoba alone had 700 mosques, 300 public baths, and 70 libraries, and this was the 10th century. At that same time, Paris was a muddy village, and London had pigs wandering through the streets. But here's the wildest part. The Moors didn't just bring science, they brought style. Architecture, medicine, mathematics, poetry, fashion, astronomy, all carried the stamp of African genius. Their architects built the Alhambra, a masterpiece of geometry, water engineering, and art that still stands in Granada. Its mosaics aren't just decoration, they're equations. Its fountains flow using physics that European engineers couldn't replicate for centuries. Their doctors performed cataract surgery with silver needles. Their astronomers charted the stars and named them Aldebaran, Vega, Rigel, Betelgeuse. These are Arabic names, preserved in every telescope to this day. Their mathematicians introduced algebra, the zero, and precise measurements that became the foundation of the scientific revolution. Let that sink in. Without the Moors, there's no Newton, no Galileo, no Da Vinci, because those men built on African and Arabic discoveries. But again, history was rewritten. The word Moor slowly got stripped of its blackness. Paintings of dark-skinned scholars were lightened. Statues were recarved. Even Shakespeare's Othello, the Moor of Venice, is often played by a tanned European instead of a black man. Even though the play describes him as dark-skinned and African, the erasure runs deep. European chroniclers like George Sale and historians from the 18th and 19th centuries deliberately changed how they described the Moors. Early writers, like Ibn Khaldun and al-Makari, described them as black-skinned Africans from the Sudan. Later English historians quietly rephrased that into swarthy Saracens. See how it works. First black, then dark, then not quite white, then gone. But evidence doesn't lie. The Moors came from empires like Ghana, Songhai, and Mali, civilizations whose wealth and learning were legendary. The city of Timbuktu, for example, was not a myth, but a university town filled with manuscripts. Tens of thousands of African written books still sit in hidden archives there, many detailing science, medicine, and philosophy long before Europe's so-called Enlightenment. The professors of Europe's first universities, in Paris, Bologna, and Oxford, all studied texts that came through Moorish Spain. They translated works of African scholars like Averroes, Ibn Rushd, Avicenna, Ibn Sina, and Al-Zahrawi, a surgeon from Cordoba, whose textbook on medicine was used in Europe for 500 years. 500 years. Yet today, these names barely appear in Western classrooms. When European armies finally drove the Moors out in 1492, the same year Columbus set sail, they didn't just expel a people, they erased their memory. Statues smashed, records destroyed. Black scholars were written out of the timeline, their contributions reassigned to later European geniuses. 1492 was not a coincidence. It marked a turning point, the replacement of African power with European dominance. Within a century, the slave trade began. The same nations that learned architecture, astronomy, and philosophy from African teachers now enslaved their descendants. The irony burns. Imagine your ancestors teaching hygiene, medicine, and math to Europe, only for Europe to turn around and say you had no history, no science, no civilization. But the legacy of the Moors lives on in everything from Spanish architecture to European language. Words like alcohol, algebra, cotton, and sugar all come from Arabic, and the Arabic spoken by African Moors. Even the Spanish guitar traces back to African instruments like the oud and joni. Culturally, spiritually, intellectually, Africa is the root of Europe's rebirth. And now that we're unearthing this truth again, the shame isn't ours, it's theirs. Because you can't call a continent dark when it's the one that lit your way. This isn't just about reclaiming pride, it's about repairing reality. Because when we understand that Black history is world history, every timeline changes. Africa stops being the backdrop and becomes the main stage. So next time someone calls the Moors invaders, tell them this: they were educators. They didn't destroy Europe, they civilized it. In every cathedral that still carries a horseshoe arch, every European map that still uses Arabic star names, every word that begins with Ali is a quiet echo of who really brought the light. They erased the teachers, but couldn't erase the lessons. Europe didn't just steal gold and land, they stole identity, and they did it with a paintbrush. You see, the erasure of Black Africa didn't happen by accident. It was a campaign, deliberate, methodical, and global. Painters, sculptors, historians, and clergy all played their part. Every image of a Black king, queen, saint, or scholar was gradually lightened. Every manuscript that depicted African greatness was reinterpreted. Every history book that told the truth was rewritten. Take the Renaissance. Art was supposed to celebrate human achievement, but notice who's celebrating in every painting: pale European men with flowing hair, noble noses, fair skin, Black figures, background characters, servants, demons, or missing entirely. Michelangelo, Da Vinci, Raphael, all complicit, whether consciously or because they inherited a system that rewarded whiteness. The same pattern extended to maps and textbooks. Africa was depicted as empty, uncivilized, a dark continent of savages. Meanwhile, Europe claimed all knowledge, math, architecture, astronomy, medicine, as their own. They were master storytellers. They controlled the narrative because controlling the story meant controlling the world. Even explorers participated in the lie. Columbus, Vespucci, and their contemporaries framed Africa as mysterious and backward, while conveniently ignoring the thriving empires, universities, and trade networks they encountered. The narrative wasn't just racist, it was profitable. Paint Africa white, erase her kings and queens, and justify colonization. Museums joined the game. Exhibits of African art were restored to look European. Sculptures were repainted, faces lightened, hair textures softened. African saints in churches were turned into pale figures. By the 18th century, entire centuries of black achievement had been visually and intellectually buried. Propaganda didn't stop with art. Literature rewrote ancestry. Nobility claimed divine right by connecting themselves to ancient Greece or Rome, while erasing the Nubian, Ethiopian, and West African dynasties that actually influenced those civilizations. History was weaponized to maintain power. Even science was used as a tool. Craniometry, pseudo-anthropology, and racial classifications emerged to reinforce the idea that black people were less civilized. Meanwhile, the actual historical and scientific contributions of African societies were buried or credited to Europeans. Algebra, African. Astronomy, African. Universities, African. And yet, textbooks pretended Europe invented civilization out of nothing. Religion was not innocent. Christian missionaries repainted biblical figures as white, saints as pale, angels as European. Every stained glass window in Europe became a psychological reinforcement. Divinity is white, blackness is earthly, inferior, servile. This wasn't just art, it was mind control. Even today, the consequences are everywhere. Western media continues to depict history through a Eurocentric lens. Film, television, textbooks, and popular culture perpetuate the same visual lies. Children grow up believing black people were never kings, prophets, or teachers. Generations internalize that erasure, doubting their roots. Yet the evidence is undeniable. The Ethiopian Bible shows black prophets, Nubian pyramids, and tombs display African rulers. West African manuscripts in Timbuktu detail advanced mathematics and astronomy. Even Europe's greatest civilizing achievements borrow from African knowledge. Ask yourself, if the truth was harmless, why did they bury it under layers of paint and propaganda? Why erase entire lineages, faces, and stories? Because knowledge is power, and controlling history meant controlling minds for centuries. This is the battle for truth, reclaiming what was stolen, recognizing that whiteness was never the default of civilization, and acknowledging Africa as the foundation. Every restored image, every uncovered manuscript, every story told correctly chips away at centuries of deception. Europe's whitewashed art and books weren't mistakes. They were deliberate, coordinated, and profitable. They erased blackness to sell a story of European superiority. But art and text don't have final say. Science, archaeology, and cultural memory push back. African faces, names, and brilliance persist. They just had to survive centuries of assault. So when you see a whitewashed painting of a Roman emperor or a pale Jesus on a cathedral window, remember, that image is not history, it's propaganda. And the true history, the one they tried to hide, is far richer, darker, and bolder than they ever admitted. The question now isn't whether Africa contributed, it's how much more are we yet to uncover. And when we do, how will that rewrite everything we think we know about civilization? They told you Columbus discovered America. That's cute. The truth, Africans had already sailed those waters centuries earlier. It's easy to forget, because the story was rewritten. But the currents don't lie. The trade winds blow west from Africa, perfectly suited for sailing. African sailors were masters of long-distance navigation. They had the ships, the knowledge, and the ambition. The Sahara, the Niger River, and the West African coasts had produced navigators, cartographers, and shipbuilders who had been trading with islands and continents for centuries. Stoneheads in Mesoamerica, the Olmec's colossal faces, don't look like your textbook Native Americans. They have full lips, broad noses, and African facial features. Coincidence? Archaeologists think not. These heads suggest contact. They weren't isolated sculptures. They were witnesses, frozen in basalt, of a story textbooks refuse to tell. Trade networks point the way too. Gold, ivory, and exotic textiles moved across the Atlantic long before Europeans. West African traders had routes that linked Senegal to the Caribbean, and some of those routes intersected with Mesoamerican civilizations. It wasn't a one-way street. Cultural exchange flowed both directions. Agriculture, metalworking, and religious practices show striking parallels between West Africa and early Mesoamerica. Maps from the 15th century, some hidden, some lost, some dismissed, hint at African voyages. Sailors recorded currents, winds, and coastal outlines. They recognized islands and ports, often using names that echo African languages. These weren't mere coincidences of geography. They were charts of expertise, carried over generations. Material evidence backs it up. The Olmecs had rubber, cacao, and maize, goods Africans cultivated or traded. Ships could carry these seeds across the Atlantic. Africans understood botany, farming techniques, and preservation methods, knowledge that made transoceanic voyages not just possible, but practical. And don't overlook navigation. Africans had mastered the stars, the sun, and the waves. They used celestial navigation before Europe even dreamed of compasses for oceanic travel. This expertise gave them the ability to reach the Americas intentionally, not by accident, not by chance currents. Some historians dismiss this, claiming technology or ship design was insufficient. But the Egyptian and Nubian maritime innovations, passed down through centuries, prove otherwise. Dugout canoes evolved into large, ocean-worthy vessels. African civilizations had ports, docks, and knowledge of sails and hull design. They weren't just surviving, they were thriving on the water. Religious and cultural evidence lines up as well. Certain Mesoamerican deities and rituals mirror African spiritual symbols. Masks, figurines, and ceremonial objects suggest a shared heritage or influence. Africans didn't just bring goods, they brought ideas, science, and culture. Now ask yourself, why is Columbus celebrated for finding a land that had been touched by African sailors generations before? Because rewriting history benefits the powerful. Erase the true explorers, elevate your own, and claim the prestige. This isn't just negligence, it's theft in full daylight. Even linguistic traces appear. Certain words in Mesoamerican languages mirror African languages. Scholars studying Olmec glyphs find symbols and terms that correlate with African scripts. Some of these are subtle, some profound. The point isn't just to prove travel, it's to highlight influence. Africans weren't invisible, they were active participants in shaping the New World. Ships, artifacts, art, rituals, all these pieces converge to one undeniable conclusion. Africa was not just a distant continent, it was a source, a teacher, and a voyager. And yet when the history books were written, these Africans became ghosts. Their voyages were erased, their innovations credited to mysterious peoples or unknown influences. We're taught to think of pre-Columbian America as isolated. That couldn't be further from the truth. Africa was on the other side of the Atlantic, fully connected through trade winds, ocean currents, and maritime skill. The story isn't just about survival, it's about influence. Africans shaped the early Americas in ways that Europeans later stole, recast, or simply ignored. So when you hear Columbus discovered America, remember the sailors who first mapped those coasts weren't white Europeans. They were Africans, teaching the world, leaving clues in stone, in plants, in culture, evidence that refuses to vanish completely, no matter how hard history tried. And now the question becomes, if Africans were teaching, trading, and voyaging to the Americas before Columbus, what else did they leave behind that we've yet to rediscover? They want you to believe innovation was a European gift, that everything worth having started in London, Paris, or Rome. That's cute. The truth? Africa was the blueprint, the laboratory, the university. In Europe, they copied, they repainted, rebranded, and sold it back as their own. Take paper. Most people assume it came from China via Europe, but the truth is, African papyrus and other early forms of writing material existed long before Gutenberg. Egypt's libraries weren't just stone and sand, they were knowledge banks. Africans documented medicine, astronomy, mathematics, law, and yes, Europe eventually discovered these texts centuries later. But credit, never African. Martial arts too were stolen. Stick fighting, wrestling, and hand-to-hand combat traditions trace back to West and Central Africa. The Moors brought their knowledge to Iberia, where it was adapted, renamed, and repackaged. European knights didn't invent combat strategy, they inherited it. Europeans call it fencing. Africans call it survival, culture, discipline. Navigation is another glaring example. Africans read stars, tides, and winds like books. They built ships, capable of transoceanic voyages long before Columbus. Polynesians get some credit for Pacific navigation, but the Atlantic, Africans were first. Europe learned from African seafarers, then erased them. That map in your history book, someone's fingerprints are missing, the African ones. Medicine is the quietest theft, but maybe the deadliest. Africans developed herbal medicine, surgical techniques, and public health systems. Egyptian doctors performed procedures recorded in papyri that predate Hippocrates. European texts later recycled these discoveries, sometimes altering them, always stripping the origin. Africans became invisible in a world built on their brains and their blood. Even mathematics shows this pattern. The numeral system, algebraic thinking, geometry, African. Yet textbooks claim Greek or Arabic sources. What's funny is many of these discoveries were passed through African scholars in Cairo, Timbuktu, and Mali before Europe borrowed. They call it transmission, we call it theft. It's psychological warfare. When you erase the origin, you control the narrative. People start believing they created themselves. Civilizations appear spontaneously. Meanwhile, the real inventors are ghosts, erased from art, textbooks, and memory. Ask yourself, if these innovations were so innocuous, why go to such lengths to hide their African origins? Because knowledge is power. Credit is power. History is power. Erasing Africa allowed Europe to dominate minds and markets. It wasn't just theft, it was strategy. Africa taught the world science, law, navigation, arts, warfare, and medicine. In every innovation stolen, carried a silent message. Black people are not inventors, not leaders, not builders. That lie has lasted centuries, and it took continents, books, and art to enforce it. But here's the kicker, the evidence survives. Manuscripts in Timbuktu, artifacts in museums, and even European records that accidentally mention African contributions all scream the truth. Africans weren't passive, they innovated, taught, and influenced global civilization. And despite centuries of erasure, those contributions refuse to vanish completely. The stolen innovations question isn't about pride, it's about justice. When we acknowledge who truly invented, built, and navigated, we reclaim ownership of history itself. We recognize that the foundations of the modern world are not European, they are African. And now consider this. Every time we celebrate European discoveries, what are we really celebrating? Theft, repackaged genius, or erasure? How much more of Africa's blueprint is still hidden, waiting for the world to wake up? Every time you see a white Jesus, a pale Moses, or a European-looking King David in a stained glass window, remember this. Somebody got paid to repaint God. History wasn't enough. They had to paint divinity too, and in that act, they erased centuries of African spiritual authority. The Ethiopian Bible is one of the greatest receipts of Black biblical history. Written in GAs, it preserves ancient texts and interpretations lost to Europe. Prophets, kings, and apostles, described as Black, were whitewashed, repackaged, and exported as European figures. The erasure wasn't accidental. It was systematic. The church, scholars, and rulers colluded to claim divine heritage for whiteness while denying Africans their spiritual blueprint. Black prophets weren't just peripheral figures, they were central to the story. Leaders, visionaries, advisors to kings, moral compasses, and teachers. In Ethiopia, scriptures describe kings like Menelik and priests who traced their lineage to Solomon, rooted in African soil, in African identity. These were the intellectual and spiritual leaders of their time, yet European translators, printers, and missionaries slowly diluted, deleted, and lightened these identities. Even apocryphal texts reveal the same pattern. Manuscripts preserved in monasteries, in Axum, describe visions, laws, and moral lessons taught by black prophets. These texts show Africa as a source of wisdom, philosophy, and ethical governance. But the moment European colonial powers gained access, they reinterpreted, removing references to black divinity, inserting European faces, and subtly shifting meaning. Art was equally manipulative. Churches across Europe commissioned biblical paintings with European features. Angels, prophets, and Christ himself were whitened. It wasn't just aesthetics, it was authority. You see a pale prophet, you internalize their superiority. You see a black prophet, erased. You doubt the legitimacy of African civilization. That's psychological warfare in its purest form. Even today, few people know that the Ethiopian Orthodox Church has one of the oldest, continuous biblical traditions in the world. Their canon includes books removed by European churches, texts that preserve African law, prophecy, and cosmology. When history is taught from European lenses, these truths are buried, but the manuscripts, the chants, and the liturgies survive, quietly defying centuries of erasure. Ask yourself, why hide an Ethiopian Bible? Why erase black prophets from a narrative they wrote, maintained, and interpreted long before Europe discovered the continent? Because if divinity is white, then legitimacy, morality, and civilization can all be claimed by whiteness. It's a clever system. Control faith, control perception, control the people. Even linguistics carries evidence. Ancient texts describe God, angels, and sacred spaces with African descriptors tied to geography, skin tone, and cultural symbols. These weren't accidental details. They were integral to understanding divinity through an African lens. Europeans removed context, repainted characters, and framed history as though black people were passive recipients, not originators, of spiritual insight. The psychological impact of this erasure is profound. Imagine generations growing up taught that morality, wisdom, and divinity are inherently white. Imagine questioning your own heritage, your identity, your right to knowledge, because every image, every text, every sermon told you the same lie. That's how power works. It doesn't just occupy land, it occupies minds. Yet the Ethiopian texts, the oral traditions, and the hidden manuscripts resist. They survive in monasteries, caves, and private collections, carrying the truth forward. They remind us that African people were not just observers of faith, but architects of morality, prophecy, and law. And when we reclaim these stories, we reclaim more than history. We reclaim identity, dignity, and spiritual sovereignty. So next time you see a Europeanized biblical image, remember this: that's not history, that's propaganda. And buried beneath the paint and translation lies a lineage of black prophets who shaped morality, civilization, and spirituality long before Europe wrote its own story. The real question now is, if we uncover more of these texts, how much will it rewrite the Bible as we know it and challenge the centuries-long lie that divinity was ever exclusively white? Erasure isn't just history being stolen. It's a virus. It infects identity, confidence, and memory. When your ancestors are removed from textbooks, churches, and monuments, It's not just their stories that vanish. Your sense of self starts to vanish too. That's the power of psychological warfare. Controlling the past to control the present. Ask yourself this: why are African contributions to philosophy, science, navigation, and governance constantly downplayed or omitted? Because a people who forget their origins become easier to manipulate. Forget who built the pyramids, the libraries, the empires, and suddenly, the people teaching math, astronomy, and medicine, centuries later, appear to have created it all themselves. You internalize a lie long enough, it starts to feel like truth. This isn't accidental. Colonial powers, European scholars, and the church coordinated it. Paintings, statues, textbooks, even stories told to children were curated to replace black faces with white ones. Every erased hero, every stolen invention, every misattributed discovery chipped away at cultural memory. Africans weren't just removed from history, they were recast as myths, background characters, or silent witnesses. Memory shapes reality. When generations grow up believing their ancestors were passive, inferior, or non-existent in global achievements, it triggers self-doubt, internalized inferiority, and identity fragmentation. That's why systems of oppression last centuries. It's not only about physical control, it's about mental captivity. Look at the evidence in art. European painters discovered classical Greece, yet the philosophy they celebrated was taught by black thinkers first. Statues and frescoes depict gods, leaders, and saints as white, even though the sources indicate otherwise. Schools glorify European kings, while silent on African pharaohs. Libraries hold translations that whitewash texts. Every misrepresentation reinforces a subtle, consistent message. Black genius is optional, replaceable, invisible. Language itself carries this effect. Terms like primitive or savage were systematically applied to African civilizations, while Europe claimed credit for any technological or cultural advancement. It's a narrative designed to convince the colonized that they are behind, that their potential is borrowed, stolen, or irrelevant. Over time, the community begins to police itself, unconsciously validating the erasure. There's also generational trauma baked into this psychology. When children grow up with textbooks, media, and religious texts that omit or distort black history, they inherit a double burden: the historical erasure itself, and the guilt or confusion of questioning what they were taught. This makes reclaiming history an act of resistance, not just scholarship. Yet, the mind has resilience. Oral traditions, folklore, rituals, and family stories carry fragments of truth, even when formal history tries to bury them. These memories defy centuries of erasure, keeping knowledge alive. It's why Ethiopia preserved the Bible, why Mali retained libraries, and why African influence echoes in Americas and Europe despite deliberate suppression. Memory is rebellious. It survives even when inked history fails. Psychologists call this collective amnesia, but it's not natural, it's manufactured. Erasure is a tool wielded to weaken a people, mentally and spiritually. It's subtle, pervasive, and persistent, and it's why uncovering hidden histories isn't just academic, it's a liberation of the mind. Every recovered story, every restored image, every acknowledgement of African achievement rebuilds confidence, identity, and power. You see this in the diaspora today. Misrepresentation in media, biased curricula, and cultural appropriation are modern extensions of historical erasure. They continue to distort reality, suggesting black contributions are derivative or peripheral. The lie evolves, but the tactic is the same: erase, misattribute, and claim superiority. So what happens when a people forget? They become susceptible to lies about themselves. They undervalue their own genius, doubt their history, and internalize the hierarchy imposed on them. But when the truth is revealed, when art, texts, and monuments are decoded and reclaimed, the effect is revolutionary. Pride returns, curiosity ignites, and generational trauma begins to unspool. The question then isn't just what was erased, it's how deep does the erasure go? And more importantly, If we can uncover the hidden truths, how do we rebuild not just history books, but cultural identity, collective memory, and self-belief? Because that's the endgame, to recover a people's mind, restore dignity, and reclaim the blueprint that was never theirs to steal. When you think about African resistance, don't picture a few scattered rebellions. Think of entire civilizations, defying centuries of erasure. Ethiopia stood uncolonized, while Europe carved Africa into playgrounds for profit. Benin resisted looting and preserved complex governance long before Europeans tried to rewrite its story. Mali built libraries in Timbuktu that rivaled anything in Europe, teaching mathematics, law, and astronomy. In Haiti, it proved that enslaved Africans could overthrow the system and create a nation from nothing, literally rewriting the rules of freedom. Ethiopia is the crown jewel of resistance. While European powers claimed divine right to conquer, Ethiopian emperors and their people held fast, preserving their culture, religion, and sovereignty. They maintained one of the oldest continuous Christian traditions in the world. Their manuscripts, liturgies, and monuments are proof that Africa wasn't just surviving, it was thriving and self-determined. Even under global pressure, Europeans had to rewrite their narrative, downplay Ethiopia, and label it isolated to make the world think Africa was weak. Benin tells another story. When Europeans tried to plunder its art and wealth, the Oba and his court protected it for centuries. The Benin bronzes, masterpieces of African artistry, weren't just decoration, they were historical records, legal documents, and symbols of power. Europe looted them later, hiding their origin in museums. Yet the cultural memory persisted. The people remembered. The stories were passed down. Art became resistance. Mali, Timbuktu is more than a city, it's a beacon. Its libraries housed hundreds of thousands of manuscripts, covering astronomy, law, medicine, and philosophy. Scholars traveled from all over Africa, the Middle East, and Europe to study here. This was Africa's intellectual capital, centuries before Europe even dreamed of printing presses. And still, European textbooks paint the continent as dark during this period. They omitted the proof that Africa had libraries, universities, and advanced scholars. They buried the evidence in plain sight. And then there's Haiti, the ultimate lesson in survival and revolution. Enslaved Africans rose, fought, and won, establishing the first black republic in the modern world. Europe assumed Africans could never self-govern. They underestimated resilience and strategy. Haiti became a living counter-narrative to every lie about African inferiority, proving freedom is not a gift, it's seized. European powers responded with sanctions, embargoes, and lies, but the example endures. African people refused erasure, and victory was possible. Resistance isn't always armed battle. Survival itself is resistance. Preserving knowledge, culture, religion, and identity under threat is defiance. Every community that maintained language, oral history, and traditions during colonialism and slavery fought back. Every story passed down that contradicts European propaganda is a weapon against erasure. Ask yourself how many civilizations survived, thrived, and innovated under centuries of attempted erasure. Ethiopia, Benin, Mali, Haiti, these aren't exceptions, they are evidence, proof that African agency cannot be destroyed. Even when the world said you are nothing, African people refused the narrative. The lesson here is stark. Resistance and survival are intertwined. You can't erase a people if they remember themselves, if they continue their traditions, if they protect knowledge. The more Europeans tried to whitewash Africa, the more African culture adapted, persisted, and spread. Even through forced migration, slavery, and cultural suppression, the African diaspora carries this blueprint today. Every artifact, manuscript, and story preserved in Africa and the diaspora is a trace of resistance. Every rhythm, culinary tradition, language, and practice that survived is a rebellion against erasure. The fact that we can trace African influence across continents in art, science, religion, and governance is a testament to survival. And here's the twist. the world doesn't teach you this, because resistance undermines the lie of European superiority. If you know Africa built, defended, and innovated civilizations, you start questioning every narrative fed to you. You start seeing the theft, the propaganda, and the erasure for what it really is, a conscious strategy to maintain power. So the question remains, if these civilizations could survive centuries of assault and remain vibrant, what does that tell us about the potential still buried in African identity today? How much more knowledge, culture, and genius is waiting to be reclaimed, not as a relic, but as a foundation for empowerment and pride? History isn't just erased in dusty books anymore. Today, it's curated in headlines, TV shows, social media feeds, and Hollywood scripts. The same strategies that painted African prophets white, looted libraries, and deleted empires are alive in 2025, just digital, algorithm-driven, and more subtle. Control the narrative, control the mind. That's how erasure evolved, from ink on parchment to pixels on a screen. Take Hollywood. Every blockbuster about ancient civilizations, biblical stories, or legendary heroes leans European. Cleopatra, whitewashed, Egyptian gods, white, African empires, background extras, or fantasy kingdoms that conveniently ignore historical reality. Children grow up learning that black people were never architects of history, just incidental characters in someone else's story. And when they question it, algorithms drown them in content that reinforces the same erasure. Media is also political. When African leaders or activists challenge dominant narratives, mainstream platforms often silence, misrepresent, or mock them. Look at textbooks, films, and documentaries. Centuries of African achievement are condensed into a few lines or token figures. Africa becomes war-torn or chaotic, never advanced, never intellectual. News cycles reduce cultural brilliance into poverty porn or exotic curiosities. The purpose isn't entertainment, it's mind control. Social media amplifies this quietly. Memes, viral videos, trends, all can subtly reinforce stereotypes. Historical inaccuracies spread faster than ever. It's easy to feel seen online. But if your history is misrepresented in your own culture, the reinforcement is insidious. Your identity becomes negotiable. You start doubting the value of your heritage. Generations inherit self-doubt, curiosity warped into skepticism of themselves rather than of the systems lying to them. Even the music, fashion, and art industries participate. African culture is mined, stylized, repackaged, and exported, often stripped of context or credit. Hip-hop, Afrobeats, dance, and fashion get celebrated globally, but rarely is the history behind them acknowledged. It's like your ancestors' genius can be borrowed, commercialized, and turned into entertainment, while the original communities remain undervalued and underrepresented. Advertising reinforces perception too. Black success is framed as exceptional or overcoming odds, not as a continuation of historical brilliance. The average viewer is nudged toward believing African achievement is reactive, not foundational. It's subtle, but it shapes thinking. People internalize the hierarchy, questioning why they should inherit legacy, education, or pride that was systematically hidden. Ask yourself, if centuries of erasure created gaps in identity and culture, what does it mean when digital media continues the same pattern at an accelerated pace? Now, the enemy isn't just European scholars, it's globalized media corporations, algorithms, and cultural gatekeepers. The battlefield is psychological. The fight for truth is also a fight for mental sovereignty. But here's the counterpoint. Modern echoes are also opportunities. Every misrepresentation, every viral lie, creates a chance to correct it. Every overlooked library, manuscript, or oral tradition that goes digital becomes a beacon. Social media can be weaponized to reclaim history, amplify African voices, and educate on a global scale. Knowledge flows faster than erasure ever did. The diaspora is waking up. Podcasts, YouTube channels, documentaries, and grassroots educational initiatives are challenging centuries of falsehoods. Black creators can now contextualize history in real time, connect it to modern experiences, and reclaim narratives. The stories that were hidden for centuries are now shared across continents instantly. The chains of the past are digital, but so are the tools to break them. This is why the fight today isn't just about monuments or textbooks. It's about the collective mind, perception, and cultural pride. Every image, every video, every article shapes identity. Every algorithm either reinforces erasure or helps dismantle it. African history isn't lost, it's contested, and we are witnessing the next battleground: perception, narrative, and self-belief. So the question becomes, how do we take control of our story in a world that still profits from misrepresentation? If our ancestors survived centuries of erasure, built civilizations, and resisted empires, what does that make us today? If we refuse to let algorithms, media, and curated content dictate our history and identity. Reclaiming history isn't a suggestion, it's a revolution of the mind. When centuries of erasure teach a people they were passive, inferior, or absent from the story of civilization, every act of remembrance becomes an act of rebellion. Cultural reawakening isn't nostalgia, it's a tactical, spiritual, and intellectual reset. It's saying, we see you, we know the truth, and we are taking it back. Look around the diaspora. Black scholars, artists, filmmakers, musicians, and writers are unearthing archives, translating texts, and decoding artifacts that mainstream history tried to bury. Libraries in Mali, Ethiopia, and Ghana are opening digital doors to the world. Manuscripts in Timbuktu, long dismissed or ignored, are now viral treasures on global platforms. This isn't just academic, it's identity reclamation. Every recovered story rewrites what you thought you knew about yourself. Cultural reawakening also happens through art and media. Films, novels, and music that center African agency disrupt centuries of narrative control. When you see a black Cleopatra, a Nubian mathematician, or a Moorish engineer on screen, it's more than representation, it's a reminder. Our ancestors weren't extras in history, they wrote it. And the modern generation can reclaim that agency too. Language too plays a role. African words, dialects, and philosophical concepts that survived the Middle Passage are being revived. Names, rituals, and traditions that colonial powers tried to erase are returned to the public sphere. Every ceremony, festival, or cultural practice is a blueprint of resilience, a code passed through time that refuses erasure. Even everyday life becomes a battleground for reclaiming identity. Cuisine, fashion, and music are more than culture, they're living history. West African cooking techniques, Caribbean storytelling, and Afro-diasporic musical scales trace directly back to African innovation. Engaging with these traditions is an act of intellectual self-defense, a claim on ancestry that colonialism tried to obscure. Education is the cornerstone. People are building curricula centered on African achievement, the Moors who rebuilt Europe, African explorers, and hidden biblical truths. Children growing up with these lessons inherit pride, not shame. They inherit context, not confusion. Knowledge becomes resistance. Every lesson grounded in truth rewires perception, breaks internalized doubt, and plants seeds of empowerment. The internet is a weapon in this fight. Platforms once used to misinform are now channels to amplify truth. Social media campaigns, YouTube documentaries, podcasts, and virtual museums distribute knowledge that was once elite, restricted, or suppressed. What they called marginal, irrelevant, or lost is now global, accessible, and undeniable. Every share, every view, every conversation is a small act of rebellion, but cultural reawakening isn't just outward-facing, it's personal. Knowing your history, understanding your roots, and seeing the lineage of brilliance behind you reshapes self-worth. It tells you, you are the descendant of empires, architects, scholars, and revolutionaries. You are not borrowed, stolen, or secondary. That knowledge rewires perception, giving confidence, clarity, and purpose. Here's the real power. Reawakening connects past, present, and future. It ties the achievements of Nubia, Mali, and Ethiopia to contemporary innovation. African philosophers who influenced Greece, navigators who mapped the Atlantic before Columbus, and engineers who built resilient cities all become part of a living blueprint. And that blueprint is yours to follow, adapt, and expand. The world tried to make you forget. The books, the paintings, the films, the media, they all conspired to make you doubt your place in history. But every recovered manuscript, every restored artifact, every spoken story is a crack in that facade. And when those cracks multiply, the edifice of lies starts to crumble. So the question is simple. If the blueprint of your ancestors is still intact, in texts, in art, in memory, what will you do with it? Will you leave it hidden, or will you study, share, and use it to rebuild identity, culture, and pride? Because reclaiming history isn't passive, it's active, it's spiritual, it's revolutionary. Imagine a world where we never forgot, not just the names of kings, queens, and prophets, but the reality of their achievements, the depth of their wisdom, the brilliance of their civilizations. Imagine history books that never lied, museums that never whitewashed, movies that honored truth. Imagine seeing Africa not as a footnote or a fantasy, but as the epicenter of knowledge, innovation, and spirituality. Picture a child in Lagos or Harlem, learning that the pyramids weren't built by mythical strangers, but by black architects and engineers whose lineage stretches back millennia. Picture the pride in their eyes when they trace mathematics, astronomy, or philosophy, not to Europe, but to Timbuktu, Nubia, and the Moors of Spain. That pride becomes action, inspiration, and reclamation. Identity isn't borrowed, it's inherited. Imagine walking through European galleries where the statues, paintings, and artifacts actually acknowledge their African creators. Imagine textbooks that teach that Cleopatra was black, that Nubian pharaohs ruled Egypt for centuries, that the Moors didn't just visit Europe, but built its bridges, universities, and libraries. Every corner of civilization suddenly makes sense. It isn't a lie, a story, or a myth. It's fact, the true blueprint. Now, imagine if this knowledge was never hidden from the world. There'd be no doubt, no insecurity, no internalized inferiority. Black children wouldn't be negotiating their own value against centuries of stolen narratives. Young scholars wouldn't need to dig through the margins of history for scraps of evidence. Every African invention, every cultural export, every revolutionary act would be celebrated as it should be. The narrative flips from victimhood to brilliance, from omission to acknowledgement. Think about the spiritual dimension. Imagine seeing biblical figures as black, not abstract, not European. Imagine recognizing that prophets, kings, and queens reflected the people we see in the mirror today. Imagine the weight lifted from a culture told for centuries that it was absent from sacred history. Identity is a compass. Truth restores direction. Faith becomes affirmation rather than erasure. And it wouldn't just benefit black people. A world that acknowledged Africa's true contribution would reshape global understanding, rewrite economics, and challenge centuries of systemic inequality. People everywhere would know that knowledge, technology, governance, and art didn't start in Europe. They were borrowed, adapted, and often stolen. The lens through which the modern world views power, race, and culture would be fundamentally different. But here's the wildest part. It's possible. The evidence is still here. The manuscripts, the artifacts, the oral traditions, They survive centuries of theft, fire, and propaganda. Every reclaimed library, every restored artifact, every viral documentary is proof the blueprint exists. It's just waiting for us to wake up and use it. Imagine conversations where people speak with certainty about the Moors who saved Europe, about African explorers mapping the Atlantic, about Timbuktu's libraries and Ethiopian saints. Imagine the astonishment when they realized the wealth of knowledge that was erased wasn't fictional, it was real. And imagine the empowerment that flows from knowing you are the descendant of builders, philosophers, warriors, and visionaries. So the question hits hard: if we never forgot, if the world acknowledged what was always true, how different would life be for millions across the diaspora today? What would pride, education, and self-perception look like if we reclaimed history fully? And most importantly, how would the world change if Africa's true legacy was the foundation of global consciousness? The vision is vivid, it's emotional, it's revolutionary, and it's ours to reach for. Because forgetting wasn't destiny, it was a strategy. And now, the strategy is unraveling, piece by piece, mind by mind, generation by generation. This is it, the moment where history stops feeling like someone else's story and becomes yours. The final awakening isn't about textbooks, museums, or viral videos. It's about consciousness. It's about seeing the world clearly, understanding the lies, and reclaiming the truth for yourself, your family, and your descendants. The chains of erasure were never just physical, they were mental. And now, they're breaking. Feel it, the weight of centuries of omission, the betrayal of knowing your ancestors were erased to sell other narratives, the anger at a system that profited off your invisibility. That anger is valid, let it burn, let it fuel curiosity, research, pride. That energy is transformative. But don't stop there, turn it into action. Awareness without action is just resentment. The awakening comes in steps. First, knowledge. Recognize that Africa built civilization, that the Moors saved Europe, that Nubian pharaohs ruled with brilliance. That knowledge isn't optional, it's essential. It's a reclamation of power. Second, reflection. Internalize the reality that you are the inheritor of this legacy. Every achievement, every innovation, every cultural contribution is genetically, spiritually, and historically yours. Third, amplification. Share it, teach it, create with it. Every podcast, video, essay, or conversation is another brick in the fortress of truth. This is spiritual work. Understanding that the biblical prophets, the kings, the queens, they were black, changes perception of divinity. It shifts the relationship with faith. It says your ancestors were chosen, capable, brilliant, and seen by God. And if they could navigate empires, wars, and conspiracies to survive, so can you. That's the rhythm of empowerment. Historical awareness flowing directly into self-belief. And it's personal. Look in the mirror. Ask yourself, who am I, if not the descendant of architects, scholars, warriors, and prophets? How do I carry this lineage forward in my life? Every choice, every creation, every act of learning or teaching becomes sacred because it is continuity, proof that history cannot erase what it cannot kill: the spirit, the mind, and the will of a people determined to remember. History isn't done with you yet. Every uncovered manuscript, every restored library, every viral story is a weapon against the erasure that tried to break us. And every step you take in reclaiming, celebrating, and teaching this history is a declaration: we exist, we contributed, we endured, we thrive. No one can unwrite what we remember. Imagine a world where this awareness spreads. Communities united not by imposed narratives, but by truth. Schools teaching African contributions alongside European history. Museums displaying African genius at the center, not the margins. Young people understanding that their potential is not inherited from scarcity, oppression, or false narratives, but from brilliance, resilience, and legacy. That world isn't fantasy, it's a choice, collective, deliberate, and unstoppable. And here's the ultimate realization: awakening doesn't stop at history. It transforms culture, identity, art, technology, and even spirituality. It rewires society from the ground up. What they tried to erase becomes the foundation, and every generation that learns, remembers, and teaches ensures that the blueprint of African brilliance is not only preserved, but expanded. You are part of the movement, the chain, the continuum. So as the film ends, the question remains, what will you do with the truth? Will you settle for the half-history, the whitewashed narratives, the erasure, or will you step into the awakening, claim the legacy, and build upon it for yourself and those who come after? The choice is yours. Knowledge is power, memory is freedom, and the blueprint of your ancestors is waiting, alive, resilient, and undeniable. The final awakening isn't a moment, it's a lifetime. It's the fire that refuses to be snuffed out. It's the story told honestly, loudly, and unapologetically. And when you live it, share it, and defend it, you honor every ancestor who survived erasure, every scholar who preserved truth, and every child who will inherit a world that finally remembers. Because Africa's story was never lost, it was only hidden, and now we see it, we own it, and we will never forget again.